Peeps! Here we are this morning. At least it's morning where I am right now. I am less hoarse, so that's kind of exciting for me. Um, and today, this week, week 6, we have 19th century slavery. So a few caveats before we begin. And I probably should have said this sooner, but History 1 is a very strange beast as a class because it's American history from the beginning to the present. I don't get anywhere near the present because I'm a historian, not a presentorian. Um, but nonetheless, it's the whole shamil. Um, Most colleges, and that means community colleges, four-year colleges, universities, break American history into two sections, uh, up to the Civil War and after the Civil War. And indeed, Mount Sac has such a break. They have history, I think it's 7 and 8. But they also have this history 1. Fine, happy to teach it. I think it's interesting. But it means that in 15 weeks, there's no way we can cover all of American history, and there's no way we can even do any one particular subject the service it needs. That is, we're very much, this is like being at a buffet in Las Vegas, and we're going along and we're saying we'll have some of that, but we won't have that, and we'll have some of that, and because there's so much of it, we won't eat very much of anything. That's very much what History 1 is. Okay, so here we are doing in this one lecture slavery, and I will have barely touched on slavery in the same way that I have barely touched on all the topics that we've done so far and all the topics we will do after this. But we learned some things. We learned more things about slavery than they're learning in Florida. So we got that going for us. All right? All right. Also, what we have here is 19th century slavery. American slavery started in 1665 and it went all the way to 1865, after which you have this period where slaves were free. See the bunny ear quotes with my fingers around that, but nonetheless lived in very constrained circumstances we call segregation. But anyway, 200 years of slavery. It shifts through time. It's different depending on what decade and century you're in, and where you are, etc., etc. So, sorry, my sister's sending me some messages, and so my computer's going ding. Just ignore that. Anyway, um, we're going to do 19th century slavery. So, the state of slavery in the maybe 50 years before it was legally abolished. Cool? All right. So that's our intro stuff there on our fancy slide. Um, uh, the thing about a lot of naysayers, you hear this a lot in red states and among conservatives who say we progressives or liberals are making way too much of slavery. It just wasn't that bad a thing. And indeed, Ron DeSantis, that just a human being and governor of Florida, um, once said that the great thing about slavery was that it gave slaves, uh, uh, it, it, it taught them a living. It taught them a job. Oh, dude, you're so disgusting. But here's the thing, and then the other thing people say is, well, there was slavery all over the world. The Greeks had slavery, the Romans had slavery, even in Africa they had slavery. Those things are all technically true, but they're also untrue insofar as, if you see there my B there in the middle of our arrow, New World slavery, which is what North America had, the New World. New World slavery was extremely different from slavery in the Old World, or slavery from ancient Greece, or slavery in Africa. And New World slavery was different in two respects. One, it was lifelong. That is, in ancient Greece and in Africa, you could be taken prisoner and then you could be made a slave for some period of time. Say you had done something naughty and you would be a slave for 10 years and then you would be freed again. In America, um, slavery was always lifelong. You were born a slave, you died a slave. And the only way that you subverted that cradle to grave slavery is you ran away, in which you were still technically a slave, But an escaped slave who had stolen him or herself, or your master freed you. And manumissions, that's the fancy word for when a master frees a slave, manumissions were very, very rare because slaves were valuable property, and most human beings don't give away valuable property. Um, and I understand how revolting it is to talk about human beings as valuable property. But indeed, in the 19th century, a healthy female slave was actually more valuable than a healthy male slave because female slaves could make you new slaves. Um, but both a healthy female and a healthy male slave were worth the kind of money that if you were to convert it to modern days, you could go down to the car dealership and buy yourself a new car. That that's how valuable slaves were, and people don't give that stuff away, right? So there's the lifelong, and then worse, it's a new world slavery was perpetual. And if you're thinking, Peg, you're being redundant, lifelong and perpetual, but they're not the same thing. Lifelong means the span of your life. Perpetual means forever. So the notion was in New World slavery is that you weren't just a slave your whole life, but that also your children were slaves because they were your children, and your children's children, and your children's children's children. That is, you never, much of Old World slavery was a condition of this particular human being who had, for some reason, landed themselves in slavery, but it wasn't a condition that was handed down to your children like eye color or 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 hair color. Um, but in the New World slavery in North America, in the United States, slavery was considered perpetual. And this is, I would argue, by far the most cruel thing about slavery is American slavery. The most cruel thing about American slavery is it didn't allow humans for the most basic human thing, which is the desire. Sorry, my recording stopped for some reason. I don't know why. Perpetual slavery didn't allow for slaves to 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 wish for better for their children. It is a very human response to giving birth to children to want better for them, to want your children to have it nicer things, to have better jobs, to have better educations, to have lives with less family trauma. And the perpetual slavery took that away from people. So, all of that. The other thing we need to know about 19th century slavery, if we are to address both maybe the people listening to this and more importantly, the people you will run into out there in the world, the people you will hear about, who will say, oh, I don't know why we're teaching slavery. It's in the past. It's over. Can we quit whining about it? It is in the cradle of slavery that Americans learn how to treat others. That is, because the United States of America had slavery from its inception, from before the American Revolution, and because the American Revolution did not solve the slavery problem, fundamentally, Americans in power and white Americans in general developed a box of characteristics about this is how you treat people who are different. This is how you treat people who are other, that they are subhuman, that they are beneath us, that they are not us, that they can do the terrible work and then we can complain about it. That it is in the cradle of slavery we learn the very characteristics of racisms and classisms that you hear spoken in the United States of America today. And that's why slavery, the history of slavery is important, because its legacy is still with us. And not only just racism against black people, but racism against anybody not white. And white supremacy, it flourishes in a post, I don't say that ex-president's name, the Orange Rapist, you know him? Um, in that post that world where that presidency gave white supremacists permission to be white supremacists openly. We are grappling with that problem more than ever. And so this topic becomes more important than ever, which is exactly why they don't want us to teach it. Yeah? Okay, that's enough of that. All right, we spent a lot of time on that first slide. Let's see if I can pick up the pace, Lamphere. Let's run the numbers, shall we? In 1800, so right after the Revolution, if the American Revolution is 1775 to 78 or 80, depending on whether you count. 78 is when the war ended. 80 is when the treaty is really worked out and stuff. But the late 1770s, shall we say that? So in 1800, there are about 250,000 slaves in the United States of America. This is 250,000 too many slaves, because slavery is human bondage. It is the owning of other human beings, and then the commensurate mistreatment of other human beings, including the sexual abuse of all female slaves and some male slaves. And if you're saying you can't know there was sexual abuse of all female slaves, yeah, you know what? I can. And if you think about it, so can you. But 250,000 slaves while it's way too many. Man, do I not want to throw away the lives of 250,000 slaves who lived in 1800. But it is fundamentally for a new nation not their biggest problem, because it's not that big a number. So the founders ignored it in the Constitution, partially because there weren't that many slaves, and partially because it was such a sticky problem. The southern states were more likely to have slaves because slaves were helpful in growing crops that needed a lot of labor, in the same way that picking strawberries or asparagus or lettuce requires a lot of labor, and we kind of, as a nation, have to have immigrant labor to pick that, because white people ain't going to do it, and nobody wants to pay more money for their food. Maybe we should. That's another question. But anyway, so southern states didn't want the founders messing around with slavery, and the new nation was a new nation. It was a perilous thing. It was a teetery-tottery, will it make it, will it won't. 200 and some years later, we can go, well, of course it was going to make it. But imagine the insecurity about that in 80. So 2 reasons. Slavery is essentially ignored in the Constitution. There aren't that many slaves, and nobody wants to irritate the southern states. That'll be an ongoing problem. And so the only place you see slavery mentioned in the original Constitution, so the Constitution as it stands in the first 10 amendments, is in the 3/5 law, which said that slaves would be counted for purposes of representation as 3/5 of a human being, which is problematic because it's morally repugnant to count a human being as 3/5 of a human being. But also what it does, the other thing that makes it morally repugnant, is that slave owners got extra power in Congress. If you got to decide how many representatives you got in Congress based on your population, they got to count their slaves who didn't get to vote. Wow, just fought a war about taxation without representation, and then turned around and did it to the slaves. Holy shit. The thinking at the time was that the number of slaves in America had been gradually decreasing, so there was no point in fussing about it. And the reason that the slaves had been gradually decreasing is because the slaves had been primarily used between 1665 and 1800 to grow, in North America, to grow tobacco. In the Caribbean, they grew a lot of sugar, but sugar didn't grow in North America, not even down in like Florida and Georgia very well, because it just wasn't hot enough. It's hard to believe, but it wasn't the Caribbean. But mostly to grow tobacco, and the market for tobacco had gone in the dumper. People had been crazy about it for a long time, and then it kind of fell out of favor. And then the crop that you think slaves were primarily used for, cotton, in 1800 wasn't really a crop, because it was hard to grow and even harder to turn into something for a bunch of reasons, which I will explain in the next slide. But here what we have in America is the nation born thinking, we don't have to solve this problem, because this problem will solve itself, because increasingly the people who own slaves aren't going to need them. And then something changes. Let's go see what it was. All right, I am now going to tell you almost everything I know about cotton. Cotton comes in two forms, short staple cotton and long staple cotton. Short staple cotton grows readily in a variety of places. If you ever drove to Phoenix, you would drive by a bunch of cotton fields out there. But here's the problem with short staple cotton. Its bolls, that it's little fluffs of cotton, are really have lots of tangled up fibers, like a cotton ball, and then they're full of these little sticky black seeds. So it turns out that even if you had slaves to pick out the sticky black seeds and to comb the fibers into a row so that you could spin them and turn them into fabric, it wasn't cost effective. Um, Long staple cotton had these long silky fibers and very few seeds, so you could effectively grow that with slave labor and make some money. But long staple cotton was like sugar; it needed a really long growing season and really hot, humid places, and so it only grew in a couple of places in the United States. Most of the other places it just didn't grow because it was too dry. So cotton wasn't a big crop until in 1974, Eli Whitney, who's famous, and Catherine Littlefield, who's not famous, invented the cotton gin. I have a picture of it there in the middle. And the notion with the cotton gin is that you could grow the short staple cotton, and the cotton gin would, through a series of mechanisms, comb out the seeds and straighten out the fibers so that you get coming out of one side all the gunk and out of the other side this perfectly cleaned out cotton. So the cotton gin is this invention that suddenly makes it possible to grow cotton all over America. And here's the deal. Eli Whitney had this idea for this machine, and everybody knew that the guy, and I'm going to say guy, who invented something to deal with short staple cotton was going to get immensely rich and famous. And so Whitney's like, yeah, I'll do that. He's having trouble, and so Catherine Littlefield, who is a rich widow and owns a farm and some slaves, says, why don't you come to my house and you can eat and sleep here for free and you can work in my barn and work on your invention. So it starts like that, but then he would come in for dinner and he'd be like, well, here's my problem today and here's the thing I'm having trouble with. And she started just saying, well, maybe you should do this and maybe you should do that. Then she started going out to the barn and helping with the invention. And between the two of them, they got a working cotton gin. Only women weren't allowed to apply for patents, and in this world, women didn't get credit for anything, or men took credit for things women did. Ooh, boy, good things have changed, right? Uh-huh, sure. Anyway, Eli Whitney gets all the credit, both in his time and in history, for inventing the cotton gin. Boo! And the cotton gin will then change everything. See, that's 1794. It takes a while to get the thing patented, to run it around, to get people convinced it works. It's an expensive machine, so to get it out there. And about 1800, when the founders are like, yeah, we didn't have to fool around with slavery, and there aren't that many slaves, suddenly the market is flooded with these working cotton gin machines, and all sorts of people can grow cotton in their fields, but to grow cotton, they now need more slaves. They need more slaves to plant the cotton, to hoe the cotton, to pick the cotton. More slaves, more slaves, more slaves, because the cotton gin makes cotton something people with land and slaves can grow and make a shit ton of money. So you can see what's going to happen next. Let's go see it. All right, here's the numbers. And admittedly, the chart's a little blurry, but you can see the bars. What happens is, see, over there, that first blue bar is 1790. And notice we've got this small number of slaves. Again, still too many. Let's not pretend it's not. One human slave is one too many. And notice no green bar for cotton growth, right? And then 1820, now we're talking post-cotton gin, and we've got some cotton growth, and see how comparatively the number of slaves has nearly doubled, um, with just that amount of cotton growth. And then 1840, more cotton growth, way more slaves. And then 1860, way more cotton and a lot more slaves. So there's a direct correlation between cotton and slavery. And for good reason. Before readily available cotton, people mostly wore wool, some linen, but linen was expensive and only rich people. You would wear maybe a linen close to your body. Ladies would wear this chemise, which is, it would look kind of like a nightgown to you, and then you'd put your clothes on over that. Um, and the wool might be a little scratchy, but the chemise would protect your skin from the scratchiness of wool. And men would wear uh, uh, under underdrawers that look kind of like knee length shorts and undershirts made of linen, if you could afford that. And then clothes would be made of wool, which is, you guys live in California. It's warm here. Can you imagine wearing even light wool? Because you can get wool fairly light, but it's still wool. Uh, and then the world says, hey, you can wear cotton clothes. And you're like, hell to the yeah. Indeed, probably every single one of you sitting here now are wearing some kind of cotton or cotton poly blend because it's so soft and so comfortable and so breathable. It's a fantastic fiber. Unfortunately, historically, you needed slave labor for it. Now we have immigrants. Um, and slavery is morally troubling, but economically so fantastic. Indeed, and I'm not picking on capitalism here. I too live in a capitalist nation and benefit from many of the conditions of capitalism. But when people talk about pure capitalism, slavery is pure capitalism. The owners of the means of production own everything. They own the land, they own the machines, they own the workers, and then they gain all the profit, and the workers get none of it. And if you can imagine how much money you could make at a business if you didn't have to pay your employees, if all you had to do was house them in shitty housing and then feed them, you know, terrible food, poor people food, right? Lots of carbs, and not a lot of meat and veg. You could make an immense amount of money at a business like that, couldn't you? And people did. All that cotton growth and all that slavery that you see in that 1860 column represents an immense amount of wealth. Slavery is fundamentally, at its base, an economic institution. Southerners didn't own slaves because they were racists. Southerners owned slaves because slaves made them money. And then, knowing it was wrong, they developed ideas, racist ideas, about why it was okay to own slaves because they wanted to make them money. Always follow the money. The money will tell you where and why things happen. All right? Let's take it the next slide. Okay, here we are at about what I was hinting at in the last slide, that you get this. You go in 1800 from 250,000 slaves to 1860, 4 million slaves. That's a 16 times increase in slaves in 60 years. That's super rapid social change. And here's what you know, because you too have lived through times of super rapid social change, like, say, the pandemic and post-pandemic world. And we know that social change, particularly rapid social change, is stressful. So we got that. Um, so what happens is the more and more slaves that some people own, the more and more committed those people are to slavery because of the money. The commitment becomes both economic and ideological. And ideological is just a fancy word that means about ideas. And when we're talking about slavery and ideology, we're talking about racist ideas, racism. Okay? So as you get more and more slaves and you get more and more committed to the money they make you, you get more and more committed to the ideas you have about why that's okay. So slave owners and pro-slavery people say, because the cotton's grown, picked, and milled in the South, but it's turned into fabric in the North. Um, factory owners in the North are pro-slavery because they need the cheap cotton to 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 make cotton. They're using immigrant labor, mostly women. Um, they're making a whole bunch of money, and then America gets to wear cotton clothes. A bunch of them like that, and they don't really care. In the same way that you guys will like eat food at places that are immoral. Like you're like, I have gay friends, but I eat the Chick-fil-A sandwich. I don't know why, but you do, even though Chick-fil-A is firmly anti-gay. Or you shop at the places that do bad things, right? Because you're like, I don't care, I like this thing. Um, so it's not just the slave owners; it's all the people who benefit in one way or another from the products of slavery. They get more and more uh, devoted to the ideas about why slavery is okay. And fundamentally, those ideas are racist ideas that say people of African descent are inferior. I'm not saying they are. That would make me a racist. That would also be disgusting. Um, but that these racist ideas aren't accidents. They develop hand in hand. You can literally track the development of racist ideas with the increase in slaves and cotton growth in America. Um, and once you have a society that it convinces yourself that a whole group of people is inferior and bad, and we'll do a little bit more on that later, um, then you can do whatever you want to them. In the same way that American conservatives feel completely comfortable being shitty to women or immigrants or trans people or gay people or pick a group they feel comfortable being shitty to. So many groups. Because they've decided those groups are all inferior. They're not us. They're them. Them is bad. Okay? Let's go take a look in a little more details because so far all we've done is speak in generalities. We don't have one human face in this yet. We just have a whole bunch of ideas. Um, and that's all very well and nice, but that's part of what makes history boring, is sort of general talk about ideas without any human beings. So let's go see if we can do a little more human-based history. Here's the stuff probably most of you know. That being a slave wasn't fun. That they lived in bad places and they ate bad food. You can guess it because lots and lots of poor Americans live in similarly poor conditions and have similarly poor food, but without slavery. Because poverty in 20th century America is not the same as slavery, because slavery is about human bondage. It's about a human being being owned by another human being and not being able to decide the most basic things for themselves. So, while there are many things similar between slavery and modern poverty, there are many things that make it different because slavery is such a uniquely repugnant institution. So, 90% of all slaves worked in the fields because if you have slavery to grow cotton, you need your slaves growing cotton. You would then have the other 10% would have probably been maids, nannies, butlers, the blacksmith, because the blacksmith would be your local on any big plantation or in any farm, any uh, good-sized farm. He's your mechanic. He's your handyman. Um, but everybody else works in the fields, and everybody, men, women, children. Most places that owned a handful or more of slaves, and most slaves were not held in groups of like 200 or 300. They were held by sort of median rich people who had a dozen slaves or 6 slaves. Um, and 90% of those would be people who worked in the fields. Um, and children would go to the fields. It would depend from place to place, but generally around 6 years old, children would be expected to go work in the fields. And then because the whole thing was about making money, um, you fed them poor, cheap food, lots and lots of grains, cornmeal, oatmeal, and not very much protein and fresh vegetables. And then you house them in really, really cheap, poor housing, places that would have been crowded, hot in the summer, cold in the winter. Um, there is all over the American South these plantations. And you see a picture of a really beautiful plantation house there on your right. I would hope that you never ever go on one of those tours. You may never visit the American South, but if you do, do not go on a plantation tour. Or they valorize, they celebrate this lovely and gracious life that white Southerners had, but they had it at the benefit of the slaves that made all that wealth. That big house there on the right, it is paid for by the people who lived in that shack on the left. And in most plantation tours, the slave cabins are gone because they're such crummy little buildings. They didn't survive the way really beautiful old houses do. Or they just want to take them down so that we're not reminded of where all this came from. So it's a very rare place where they acknowledge that slaves made this wealth, and this is where they worked, and this is where they lived, and this is what they did. So let us not put money in the hands of people who want to pretend none of this happened. Anyway, I show you those two houses to give you the disparity. The people working in the house, people living in the house on the left worked hard so the people that lived in the house on the right could live that way. So it's very handy for the white people. All right. I'm going to apologize right now. That is a maybe trigger warning. It's pretty gruesome. This has not been a fun lecture. I don't think lectures about slavery are supposed to be fun. I haven't made a lot of jokes. I'm not having fun myself. Indeed, yesterday afternoon I was like, I should record that lecture, and I was like, I don't want to. It's hard. So I saved it for this morning. I had my 2 cups of coffee and my muffin, and said, okay, I can do this now. You can do it, Peg. The stuff is difficult. And it's difficult for a reason, because this is icky stuff. So on top of the poverty, the poor housing, the poor food, the long work hours, and they being owned by another human being, you have to throw in it the violence. And here's the thing. You don't have to beat all of your slaves. You just have to beat 1 or 2 occasionally, and they'll all be all afraid. You don't have to rape all the female slaves for all the female slaves to be afraid of sexual violence. And here's the reality that most people don't want to confront. Slavery was full of violence, not just the thing that you usually hear about, which is the whipping and the beatings, but full of sexual violence. That when you give, sadly, human beings, most specifically men, complete and total power over another human being, studies show that we will behave badly. And that when you give male human beings total power over women, sexual assault will happen. It just will happen. And I argue, and I think, and I do this in more detail in my women's history class, but that all sex between a white male owner and a black slave was ipso facto rape, even if she appeared to be consenting, because consent has to be freely given. And no female slave could actually say no to her master because he owned her. And thus, she was incapable of giving consent because she couldn't say no. So, some of the sex might have appeared consensual. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, had a long standing physical relationship with his slave Sally Hemings. He fathered 6 children upon her. He started that relationship when she was 14 years old. There's a long running argument among historians about whether that relationship was consensual. And I think it's a ridiculous argument. He owned her. Of course it wasn't consensual. She may have played along because she recognized that this was a fairly good deal and that he would free her children, and indeed he did. And so she made a deal, but in no way could it be considered consensual. He owned her and took up with her when she was a minor. So there's so many problematic things about that. What you see here are some sort of many. You could go online. I don't recommend it. I think the pornography of violence is unpleasant. Isn't it sort of titillating and interesting to see the horrible things that people could do to people? But it's super important to remember when people in America are talking about slavery and how will the slaves learn to trade, or it taught them discipline, or all this stupid racist nonsense, as if black people couldn't do those things for themselves. But that all of this was underwritten by the threat of physical and sexual violence. All of it. Which makes it even more morally repugnant than human bondage. Or maybe that's part of human bondage. One of the reasons human bondage is repugnant is because it leads to this kind of thing, and this kind of thing is disturbing and disgusting in so many ways. Anyway, you can tell how uncomfortable I am. I don't like this stuff. And no one should. It's not cool. Okay, we're going to switch gears here a little bit, and just for a couple of slides, we're going to talk about white dudes. And I don't want you to be offended. Holy shit, Peg couldn't even get halfway through a lecture about slavery before she went back to white people. But it's not that. What we're aiming at is we're trying to understand the racist ideologies, this racist set of ideas by which people define black men. But to understand that, we need to understand what the ideas, the ideologies about white manhood was. That is, what is sort of the notion, this is what a man should be, because then you can guess racism will take all those ideas and turn them on their head and say, see, but black men are that thing, so they're not real men, so it's okay what we do to them, right? So here we slip into the white man stuff, but it's only so we can better understand the racist ideas we're going to talk about in a few slides, okay? So have patience with me. Plus, in the next slide, I think, I'm going to throw in some fun stuff. We're going to take a little break to talk about something ridiculous. But let's get through this one. So, 19th century gender ideologies, right? Ideas about how manhood was, were that real men were Christian gentlemen. That a Christian gentleman, on top of being white and at least middle class, if not upper middle class, and looking a certain way, right? Having a certain suit and a certain haircut and a certain set of chin whiskers, that a real man had, a Christian gentleman had these characteristics. That a Christian gentleman was hardworking. 19th century Americans put a fair stake in being hardworking. And if you're thinking, well, the slave owners didn't work hard. Well, yeah, they did. They just didn't work in the fields. That running immense plantation with all the slaves and all the cotton, it was like running a corporation. So America is even today, even more so today, full of men who work hard sitting in a desk, and women, but we're talking about men today in this lecture, uh, who sit at a desk and push papers for a living, and that's hard work. So this notion that a real man wasn't a layabout, he worked hard. He worked hard to make more money. He worked hard to support his family, etc. A real man, a Christian gentleman, was intelligent and well educated. These are two different things. This is an age that deeply valued intelligence and a person being well spoken. They loved a speech peppered with classical allusions to Plato and Cicero and Shakespeare. They did not. We have this culture in America now where American men can be sort of vigorously and aggressively dumb, and it's okay for some of them. I'm thinking about that stupid Kansas City Chiefs kicker who gave a speech about how women should be mothers and babies. That's a guy who's not only dumb, he's being aggressively dumb and proud of it. And the ex-president, the orange rapist, was aggressively dumb, and a shocking number of Americans don't care. Don't care. 19th century Americans would have been appalled by that guy because he was so aggressively ignorant. 19th century Americans were big fans of people who were smart and well educated and knew things that they could talk about. They loved that shit. They loved an hour and a half speech peppered with quotes from great men. And perhaps most importantly, so one, a Christian gentleman is hardworking. Two, a Christian gentleman is intelligent and well educated. And three, a Christian gentleman is self-controlled. And the three ways, look at threes. Human beings love groups of three. A Christian gentleman is self-controlled. He's emotionally self-controlled. We still have this one today, the sort of notion that real men don't cry or weep. It's okay. I think that's why guys like sports, because that's where you can jump up and down and scream and touch other men, and it's all okay. But that in the main, you guys are supposed to stay in kind of a mid-range of emotions. Women, we're allowed to experience the highs and the lows with no public shaming. Men are supposed to be emotionally self-controlled. 19th century men thought, 19th century people thought men should be physically self-controlled. So you should sit like this gentleman sitting with his legs crossed and his hands there in his lap. So you're not sprawled on the sofa with your legs spread wide. You have physically controlled your body. You walk and speak with care. You're not flinging yourself about wildly. You are not dressed immodestly. Physical self-control. And then lastly, that a real man, a Christian gentleman, should be sexually self-controlled. There was, and we covered this in my women's history class, this notion that women in the 1900s, that women, nice women, good women, didn't like sex. This is almost patently untrue because human beings are human beings. And most human beings know that sex, when done correctly, is delightful. You'll know when you're married. Or not. Let's stop talking about that, shall we? Nobody wants to hear about sex from their 60-year-old professor. Um, but they didn't condone sort of sexual athletes. Dudes are like, yeah, I had sex with 30 women and I bonked her. None of that. This sort of notion that a real man, a gentleman, controlled his appetites and his impulses. That he had sex, but he tried to keep it to a minimum so as not to offend his wife. That he didn't visit prostitutes, or at least didn't do it very often. Um, it makes sense. All this control. The 19th century, it's the Victorian era. There's a lot of obsession with control. Okay? So again, this sort of 19th century manhood. He was hardworking, he was intelligent, he was emotionally self-controlled, physically self-controlled, sexually self-controlled. You might even say repressed. I think that'd be fair. All right? Okay. Next slide. This part is really fun in the classroom. I'm only sorry we're not doing that. So much fun in the classroom because I have hand motions and body motions, and it when done by a 60-year-old white woman with blue hair, people find it immensely funny. But for, this is just a little, because the slavery thing's been so hard. We're going to take this little middle thing, and we're going to talk about the history of male masturbation. Yes, that's right. I said it. Let's go forward. Um, so 19th century Americans believed in this. This goes, to be fair, it goes hand in hand with the 19th century manhood thing that we were talking about. And 19th century Americans were weird about sex, which we'll get to when we get to the racist ideas about black men. So it does have a part in this lecture, but this is also just ridiculous and a little bit fun, and we're taking a break. 19th century Americans believed in the somatic system. Soma means body. Sort of this notion that the body was a closed system that only had X amount of energy. Think of your energy as a pie, right? And that you have, I'm not saying this is true. There's actually no biological proof for this. I'm telling you what 19th century Americans thought. That you had this like pie's worth of energy. And if you spent your energy in one place, it would not be available in the other place. And because 19th century Americans valued hard work and 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 um, um, and intelligence, they thought you should spend your energy there and not elsewhere. And because men were supposed to be sexually self-controlled, one of the things they thought was that if men spent too much energy on sexy time, that would, rot their brains. 19th century Americans might have thought, well, that guy wears glasses, probably masturbates too much. That guy is not very bright, probably masturbates too much. That is, there was this deep, deep notion that men who in some way failed, for whatever purposes, to meet the 19th century standards of manhood. They were lazy or not that bright, or in some way weak. That was probably that they had drained their energy with excessive touching of self. Too much spanking the monkey, we might say. And they were deeply worried about this. So there were all sorts of like self-help books for men about how to control your impulses, how to not touch the monkey, how to not spend your energy in the groinal region so that you could use it in your brain or to keep your eyes sharp. Again, there's no actual proof any of this stuff is real because it's not. This is what they believed. Indeed, there were so many self-help books that it occurred to a couple of people, more than a couple of people we're going to talk about too, that there might be money to be made from this. So a guy named Sylvester Graham, he invents this whole wheat cracker. Yeah, you see this coming. And he markets it to men. He says, instead of eating refined white flour and bacon and eggs and fat for breakfast, because all that stuff, that kind of breakfast, it heats up your engine, and then you want to touch your monkey, and then your brain rots. So instead, you could eat this whole wheat cracker, and that will contain your masturbatory impulses and keep your brain sharp. And so that graham cracker is marketed when it's first brought on the market, first invented. It's marketed in covert and coded ways to men, particularly young men, as a way to control their baser sexual impulses. Graham cracker, masturbation preventative. And then a guy named William Kellogg comes along. Indeed, over at Cal Poly, just over the hill, where I have my full-time job, William Kellogg, he bought a summer ranch out in California, and he filled it full of Arabians. With all the money he made from his invention, breakfast cereal. William Kellogg did much as Sylvester Graham, but he came up with his first cereal was cornflakes, and the notion was you could eat these dry flakes from corn and be way better for you than an overheated, bacon and egg and fats breakfast, and that again your engine wouldn't be overheated and it would curb your impulse to touch the monkey, and thus keep you a real man. And so William Kellogg made a ton of money selling cereal, which was first marketed not to children, but to adult men as a physical control mechanism. Made a ton of money at that. Bought a ranch out in Southern California. 60 years later, gave it to the state of California, turned it into a university. So I just want you to know that over there across the hill at Cal Poly, where some of you are aiming your university degree, that piece of land is a product of an empire of cereal that was born to curb male masturbation. You're welcome. Anyway, do you love that? And there's a disturbing little picture of a man in a suit with a kind of, I'm just going to say it, penis guard. I mean, the notion was that you put your junk in this little metal cage and then you couldn't touch it because, what? Why? Anyway, you're welcome. Next slide. Okay, way less fun. No fun at all. So if we remember, we had the Christian gentleman and the weird sexual impulse stuff. So we know that 19th century Americans have really firm ideas about what a man should be, and they have pretty weird ideas about sex. So that if you want to talk about racist ideas that justified slavery, which was really about economics, we have to talk about what they call the Sambo ideology, or what historians call it. So there's this notion, we call this set of ideas Sambo. It's an icky word, because that's what racist words are. But the notion was that Sambo was the exact opposite of a Christian gentleman. So you could actually do this math without me even doing the lecture. We could just literally have gone Sambo was blank, Sambo was blank, Sambo was blank. So if a Christian gentleman is intelligent and well educated, then Sambo was stupid, dumb, ignorant. If Christian gentlemen are hardworking, then Sambo was lazy. And if Christian gentlemen are self-controlled, Sambo was not. And in particularly Americans, because they were obsessed with sex, which was kind of the purpose of the masturbation lecture, on top of it just being fun, Sambo was not sexually controlled. He was sexually uncontrolled. So I'm going to back up, and I'm going to say some fairly racist stuff. Not because I believe it, not because it's true, but we have to talk about these ideas because I think, and I think you would agree with me if you're being honest, these ideas are still floating around out there. So again, sort of this notion that Sambo, that black men were stupid, not just poorly educated, but fundamentally stupid. And thus it was okay to enslave them because they just, as a group of people, weren't as smart as white people, which made slavery okay. They're like, I'm going to say the word retarded. And you can't let those people run amok by themselves. That Sambo was lazy, that black men would not work if left to their own devices. They would just laze about and do nothing. And that slavery is good for black people because it made them work, because it taught them a work ethic. This is indeed partly what Ron DeSantis was referring to when he talked about how slavery was good for black people. Um, Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor in the 2020s, um, believes this stuff, as do a lot of Americans. Um, so slavery is good because it forces black men to work and work hard, because otherwise they wouldn't. And most importantly, slavery is important because it controls black men's impulses to be sexual predators. That is, that if this notion that black men were sexually uncontrolled, that black men were naturally rapists, predators, that they would fall upon any woman. And here, clearly the concern is not for black women because in slavery no one's ever concerned for black women. I have a whole separate lecture about black women in my women's history class, but we can't do it all here, remember? So we're doing this. And we're doing this because we're going to read Frederick Douglass. You should, in theory, have read it or read some of it by the time you hear this lecture. We're trying to understand that book, so we're doing black men. And then we do black women in my women's history class, which you probably won't take because you won't need to, and that's okay. Anyway, sort of this notion that black men are sexual predators and that slavery controls that, so that slavery was super, super, super important because it not only helped black people who were too stupid to take care of themselves and taught black people to work hard because they were so lazy, but also kept dangerous predators under control. And indeed, when people talked about freeing slaves, racist people, pro-slavery people, almost always came back to the predator thing. What? You're going to let all these men go and to prey on white women? What will happen? What about the white women? Oh no, oh no. As if white women aren't regularly raped by white men. As if white men are incapable of being racists. Not racist, rapists. None of this makes any sense. All of this is icky, stupid, repugnant. It's racism. That's what racism is. It's all of those things. And it's justifications up until 1865 for slavery and after 1865, because these ideas don't magically go away when slavery is abolished. After 1865, they're justifications for rampant social institutional inequality. And I think these ideas are still out there. What do you think? You think about it a little bit. Yeah? Okay. So we finish with racism justified slavery. But they had slavery to start with. They needed a justification. Which again tells you how arbitrary all of this is. It's bullshit invented to disguise the fact that some people wanted to get really, really rich by owning other human beings. Yeah. Go America. All right. I know this is hard, isn't it? I find it really hard. I think this is an important lecture, but it's not my favorite lecture to give. Frederick Douglass. So you're reading the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. I picked this for the class because I think you shouldn't take a history class and not read anything. And I'm not using a textbook because I don't like them. I picked it because it's a very small book. I picked it because it's a super easy to read book. Frederick Douglass is a wizard with words. He does very complicated ideas with very simple words. Very, very good writer. It's short. It's well written. It tells an important story. And Frederick Douglass is an important and significant American. So it accomplishes a lot of things for a history professor. And I know most of you don't want to read it. and a bunch of you aren't going to read it and you're going to fake it. And I wish you wouldn't. Here's the thing about college. You can fake everything and get through it and not learn, particularly with a history class, not learn hardly anything. You could do that and then get the grade and then make that the goal. Or you could say, as long as I'm here, I might as well make a genuine effort to learn something. Because in learning these things, I will be a better person. I will be smarter, stronger, better informed. And in those things, I will know myself and my own values better. These are your choices. I would hope that you would pick the latter and really read the book, keeping in mind that reading a book can also be an audiobook. The American Library Association says that listening to books is the same as reading them the traditional way. It fires the same parts of the brain. It's the same kind of brain push-ups. It's good for you. Audiobooks, there's no shame in an audiobook. I love an audiobook. Anyway, Frederick, let's do Frederick Douglass now. I just would really like you to read the book. And I know how easy these are to cheat. And you guys think you fool me, but I know it when I see it. But if I can't prove it, I can't do anything about it. Anyway, Frederick Douglass. So his autobiography is really, he published it in 1848. It's really very much a book saying slavery is bad. Of course it is. It's an abolition or anti-slavery message to readers. Slavery is bad and you should care about this. And this is why. So what he does when he tells his story is he's very much telling people what he's not. And I'm not going to tell you when in the story he does that because I need you to read that. And indeed, the questions that you're asked are, give me examples when he says. But in the book, he essentially says, by telling you about his life, I did this and I did that, he is telling you, I am not lazy. By telling you I did this and I did that, he's telling you he's not stupid. By never talking about sex, he's telling you he is not sexually uncontrolled. He's not lazy. He's not stupid. He's not uncontrolled. He's not any of those things that racist ideas say he is. Yeah? Next slide. So, the big finish, not for the lecture, but for Frederick Douglass, because this is what it took. We needed to understand white Christian gentleman stuff. We needed to understand they were weird about sex. We needed to understand the Sambo stuff. And then we needed to say, this is what Frederick Douglass is doing. And then we get to hear the big finish. So here's the point with the Frederick Douglass book. So keep this in mind when you write your mini essay answering the questions, because you read the book. So if he's not lazy, he's not stupid, and he's not sexually uncontrolled, he's, first box, he's not Sambo. B, then what is he if he's not Sambo? He must be a Christian gentleman. Ooh, but he's not white. Third box, he's a black Christian gentleman. Ooh, and if Frederick Douglass is a black Christian gentleman, might there be other black Christian gentlemen? First box in the second row. But if he's a black Christian gentleman, what does that suggest? Middle box in the row, what I just said, that there might be others. But it also suggests maybe the Sambo stuff is, I don't know, bullshit. Because the last box in the middle row, is Sambo even real? If and he doesn't describe anybody in the book who's stupid, lazy, or sexually uncontrolled. No one in the book is those things. So maybe black men aren't really like that. So maybe the Sambo stuff is nonsense, racist nonsense designed to convince you that Frederick Douglass and men like him are no good when it's just nonsense. And so then what the book essentially forces people to ask themselves is, well, if this guy is every bit as good as guy, every bit as much of a Christian gentleman as the white guys, should he be a slave? Should we enslave people who are so clearly human? And the point here with the book is he's trying to reach a certain crowd. He's clearly not trying to reach slaves. One, they don't need to be told. Black people don't need to be told they're human. They already know. Two, slaves can't read in the main. Most of them are never taught to read. Not because they're stupid, because they weren't taught. You wouldn't be able to read either if you hadn't gone to school. And three, they can't afford books. So he's not writing to black people. He's not writing to Southern slave owners and racists because he's not going to change their mind. You can't change the mind of people who fervently hold a belief. I'm related to some immensely conservative and racist people, I regret to say. My immediate family, my parents and one of my brothers, casually use the N-word. It's horrifying. It's just horrifying. Um, I am never going to change their minds. No amount of my liberal, hippie, witch, progressive bullshit is ever going to change their minds. And Samuel Douglas is not Samuel Douglas. Frederick Douglass is not stupid. He knows he's not going to change their minds. If for no other reason than slave owners have way too much money invested in slavery to change their minds. So who can he reach? Who can he persuade? It's not black people. It's not white slave owners. Who's left? All the other white people. The white people who don't own slaves, which is the majority of Americans, because slaves are expensive. If he convinces them, he can shift the argument about slavery. He can make those people say, maybe slavery should end. Maybe it's unfair that some white people get an unfair advantage by owning slaves. And maybe it's just wrong to own human beings who are every bit as good as I am. That's what he's doing. He never says any of that stuff. He just tells his story. But that's what he's doing. It's so smart. Yeah? Cool. You should read it. It's a good book. Anyway, next slide. Okay, we're getting there. We only have 3 slides left. We're getting there. So, Frederick Douglass is the most famous slave resistor in American history, aside from Harriet Tubman. They have a lot in common. They were both slaves who escaped, and escaping slavery is resisting slavery, right? You will no longer own me and tell me what to do. And then so Frederick Douglass wrote books and went out and gave speeches about slavery because he was trying to convince people slavery was wrong. Harriet Tubman said, I'm just going to sneak back into slave territories and help other people escape. They're both working to end slavery, but in different ways. He's out there being a speaker and a writer. She's on the ground, physically interacting with human beings, helping them escape slavery. He's speaking to white people. She's helping black people. They're both doing important sides of the coin. They're both really famous. You've probably heard of Harriet Tubman. If you haven't, wow, you should look her up. Anyway, but it turns out, I think sometimes we think that slavery couldn't have been that bad because the slaves just kept being slaves. That is, it couldn't have been that bad because they didn't resist. But remember our very first lecture, I said, all people resist. All people want to have personal power, and all people resist being disempowered. All people. And that includes slaves. And I think one of the great mistakes Americans make, and maybe people all over the world, but I'm an American historian, so I don't care what they're doing in Turkey or Sweden. One of the mistake Americans make is we think, if I don't know it, it must not exist, which is probably the most ignorant way a human being can think. So let's look at some of the ways that regular slaves that you've never heard of and that you never will hear of resisted slavery. We can fundamentally divide slave resistance into 2 big categories: active resistance and passive resistance. And this is something many of you listening to this lecture either still are or were recently teenagers. And teenagers are masters of active and passive resistance. And I'm not trying to say that being a slave and being a teenager were commensurate things, just that you know something about these resistances. Active resistance is the stuff you can see people doing. A slave could run away, and some slaves did. But a lot of slaves did not. Not because they didn't want to, but because running away was very, very difficult. Female slaves were way less likely to run away than male slaves because they often had children, and you can't run with children, especially if multiples of them, and they're very small. Um, uh, and then most slaves didn't live close to the easiest place to run away from were the border states, so the states where the next state above you was a free state. But if you lived way down south, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and that's where most slaves lived. The further south you went, the more slaves they were because the climate became more and more conducive to cotton. Um, it's simply too far to escape slavery. It's hundreds and hundreds of miles. It's the equivalent of walking from Los Angeles to San Francisco and getting there while people are trying to catch you. And I want you to think about that for a second. It's no wonder not very many slaves escaped. Slaves could also engage in slave rebellions, and we do have in American history a number of rebellions. I could do a whole lecture on slave rebellions, but I'm not going to. We just have to take my word that there were lots of them. But here was the problem with slave rebellions. They always failed because the white people in power had more power than the black people rebelling. Um, and so and then what happened in the wake of a failed slave rebellion is conditions would always be harder for the local black slaves after the rebellion. The laws would be tightened, violence would be enhanced. So slave rebellions that were not likely to succeed, none of them ever did, and they were more likely to make people's lives harder. And then the other thing you could do is just fight with the master. And indeed, Frederick Douglass has a story in his book about fighting with a master person, engaging in physical combat, as it were. But here's the thing again, even if you win the fight, you're not going to win the fight because you are a slave in a society that says you are property, and that's going to go badly for you. So, active slave resistance was difficult to accomplish and didn't always accomplish much. But there's another kind of resistance. We'll look at that next. Much more common and way harder to track is passive resistance. That is one of the reasons that we are allowed as a white supremacist nation to imagine that slaves didn't resist is because much of the resistance that they did engage in was the kind of stuff that eludes the historical record. That is, we can track escaped slaves, and we can track and give a lecture on slave rebellions. But the passive resistance is mostly secret resistance. It's super hard to track, but we know it happened. And this is the same thing any of you would engage in if you had a bad job, or in your family when you were a teenager and thought you were hard done by, and maybe you really did have a family that didn't treat you well. All of these are techniques that you could recognize. That is one of the best ways you could passively resist your slavery, which your enslavement, was just not work as hard as you could. And indeed, one would imagine that of the 4 million slaves that were alive in 1860, probably 99.8% of them didn't work as hard as they could have. Because why would you? Which would, of course, then masters would sometimes suspect that, which would reinforce the stereotype that slaves were lazy. It wasn't that they were lazy. It's that they were being forced to labor for somebody else and not benefit from it. So why would you bust your rear end for that? And if master just raped my sister or whipped my brother, why am I going to go out in the fields and do my very best for him? He's an asshole. There's lots of what I call lollygagging, and there are fancier words for that. But slaves, I mean, just imagine how economically lucrative slavery would have been if the workers had been voluntary and willing. Indeed, there's an immense argument to be made that slavery isn't even really the most lucrative economic system because your workers are unwilling and dragging their heels, and that free workers who are treated with dignity and paid a living wage will in the end actually net you more profit because they'll work harder and longer. Yeah. The other thing you could do was steal or break master stuff. I can't hoe today because my hoe broke. I don't know why. Your horse is sick. Might have been I poisoned it. Um, um, yeah, steal or break master stuff. So impede the process, hurt the master. Like you don't want to start a fight with the master because that's going to go very, very badly for him. But you could uh, steal something of masters. That when archaeologists dig up slave cabins, they've often found like silver spoons or watches buried in the ground under the slave cabin. And the slave didn't steal that thing because they thought they could make money off it. There's no universe where a slave could go into town and pawn that. What, pawn it to the white guy who would know the slave stole it? No, they took it to take it so that master wouldn't have it. Um, and then it also turns out that when anthropologists have dug up some cemeteries of white slave owners, and a shocking number of dead white children were poisoned. And you might think, well, that's just terrible. My God, I don't care what your condition is, you shouldn't poison children. I think that's a super convenient thing to think in a world where you're not enslaved and your parents weren't enslaved and your kids aren't going to be enslaved and no one's raped your sister or whipped your brother. Um, One could imagine a slave owner doing things so horrifying that poisoning his children seemed like a reasonable response. I understand what I'm saying, but I think it's worth thinking about the kind of violence that would inspire that. But then a lot of just smaller stuff too. The mule's lame, the hose broken, the I can't find this thing, that, which then leads us to our third kind of passive resistance, which also played in the stereotype. They think we're stupid, so let's just act stupid. What? You want? I thought you said to hold the back 4. Oh, you meant 40? I thought you said 4. What do I know? I'm just a dumb slave. Oops. Um, um, we've all done this at a job we didn't like or with our parents. What? I didn't know what you meant. Yeah, you knew. You knew, but you didn't. You don't want to admit it because you're passively resisting by playing dumb. The key is that slaves probably engaged in all of these things and more things, and that there's this probably massive millions of people engaged in all of these resistances to resist their bondage. Did it help end their slavery? No. Did it get them out of slavery? No. Those are the same thing, the same way. Geez, Peg. Um, did it make people feel better on a day-to-day basis? A little bit. And that's what passive resistance is about, isn't it? Yeah. So the important thing to remember is, of course slaves didn't like being slaves. Of course they resisted their slavery. And just because we don't know about it or just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. There's no such thing as a happy or contented slave. Of course they weren't happy and contented. Would you have been? No. So don't fall for that nonsense. It's white supremacist bullshit. Yeah. All right. I think we're at the end. Let's go see. Yepers. So endeth our sixth lecture. I've been talking for a long time. My tongue feels tired. Um, so good work this week. Hey, I don't know if you've heard, but back when Obama was president, a black senator, a black female senator, proposed replacing Andrew Jackson, who was a terrible racist and a terrible human being, replacing President Andrew Jackson on a $20 bill with some female. They did a number of polls and they came up with Harriet Tubman. So, and Obama approved that, but then in 2016, the orange rapist became president and was like, yeah, no, we're not going to have a $20 bill with a black person on it. And so plans for the $20, but they didn't go away. The Treasury just had to put it on hold because the racist president said so. But that thing has been, the idea of the Harriet Tubman $20 bill has been revived. President Biden, as I record this, it's 2024. The president is Joe Biden, and he's enthusiastic about it. Um, I see some. I looked it up before I made this lecture. The $20 bill with Harriet Tubman on it could be coming this year in 2024, or it could be as late as 2030. I think very much it depends on what happens in the 2024 November election for president. Um, if the Orange Rapist is reelected, I'm sure the Harriet Tubman bill will go back into storage for a while. I don't know. When you listen when you listen to this, you may know, but I don't know here and now. But anyway, I think that's pretty cool. I'm excited to see it someday. I hope I live to see it. A woman on American money. Pretty cool. An ex-slave on American money. Pretty cool. An escaped slave who helped other slaves escape on American money. Pretty cool. Yeah? Good for you. Thank you for riding out this lecture. I'm fully aware that it was not fun, that I had few jokes to tell aside from a weird little sideline into masturbation. Oh God, I just said that out loud. Um, anyway, that's the nature of this beast this week. Um, yeah, okay, good job. Good job for getting this far. Keep up the good work, huh? Miss you already.